Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Gerald Horne. Professor Horne is one of the leading historians of the left, black radicalism, anti imperialism, and global struggle. He is a professor of history at the University of Houston and is the author of over 40 books, including The Counter Revolution of 1776, which we discussed on our earlier show. Please check that out. His work challenges conventional narrative of US history by centering slavery, colonialism, and resistance. Professor Horne, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to discuss the left and its blind spots vis-a-vis race and class in particular, because last time we discussed your book 1776, there were moments where you alluded to your opposition to sections of the left on matters such as identity politics, their inability to take settler colonialism into their analytical frame. And also, there was an instance when you spoke about the Democratic Party and how any representation of Black people within the Democratic Party is severely denounced by sections of the left. So I have specific questions for you, but if you could start with an opening statement about your displeasure or your objection to sections of the left when it comes particularly to the question of race and class.
Well, first of all, let's deal with the question of race and class, and let's deal with it with regard to the Black constituency in particular, which tends to vote most heavily against the right wing, uh, more heavily than any other demographic, even despite all of the propaganda about certain Black voters being peeled off by Mr. Trump in November 2024. Now, in order to understand that, you really have to understand class, which is supposed to be the calling card of some of our friends on the left. But seemingly, it has escaped them that the Black population are descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the enslaved population, and that as a result of their objective condition, being unpaid and being cruelly and savagely exploited, they were forced into resistance, they were forced into class struggle. And so those who are oftentimes scorned by our friends on the left as being captives of identity politics are actually the epitome of class struggle. Now let's turn to settler colonialism in the first instance. Unfortunately, many of our friends on the left don't really understand U.S. history, and they take for granted the fact that a goodly number of the indigenous population were liquidated in terms of setting up this so-called republic, and therefore they have not necessarily studied, like some of us have, the origins of settler colonialism in North America go back to the 1580s in what was called North Carolina, where the 1% in London sponsored a heterogeneous mixture of diverse European forces to come across the Atlantic to uproot the indigenous. And with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, they could drag Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic. This was an exemplar of class collaboration. And so, in other words, you have two dominant trends that are still operative today. You have class struggle, most wonderfully exemplified by those who are scorned as captives of identity politics, speaking of the Black population. And then you have class collaboration, which you saw in November 2024 when Mr. Trump got 77 million votes, disproportionately and heavily from the descendants of the original settlers. Now, that somehow is not called, that is to say, the latter is not called identity politics. Although, if you look at this identity of whiteness, unfortunately, we've had quite a bit of scholarship on this lately, not only by myself, but by many others. And we see that this concept of whiteness is a totally made up identity. It's a way to forge mutuality and collaboration between those who had been warring on the shores of Europe. In the first instance, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole. I've talked about this many times, but when they cross the Atlantic, they're rebranded as white, and it's a war-fighting identity. It's a class collaborationist identity. It's an exemplar of identity politics. And then if you fast forward to today, 2025, you will see the most dramatic example of identity politics being played out in historic Palestine. Now, many of our friends on the left, even though they toss casually around this term identity politics, I've never heard one refer to Israel as an exemplar of identity politics, even though rights and responsibilities are doled out on the basis of an exclusivist ethno-religious identity, for example. And yet, somehow, that is not identity politics. And I think what this should tell you is that today, this term identity politics should be grouped along with other propagandistic terms that have taken in far too many. I'm speaking of this term of wokeness, which means you should not be sensitive to anti-racism. I'm speaking of past terms like cancel culture, for example, which was supposedly the left being censorious in terms of shunting aside those with whom they did not agree. I'm speaking of political correctness, all of these other propagandistic rubrics that have seduced too many on the left. And you can add identity politics because what we can fairly say, given my last example about how identity politics is not applied to Israel or even to Zionism, which is probably exhibit A in terms of identity politics, we should see this as a way for some on the left to disparage those without power, those perceived without influence, while turning a blind eye to the Zionist billionaires who, of course, dominate the discourse on Israel and dominate the discourse with regard to the slow motion genocide unfolding in Gaza. And so, my advice to many of our friends on the left is that unless and until they can apply the term identity politics to Israel and to Zionism, they should dispense with this term, which brings me, of course, to Senator Bernie Sanders. He was quoted in the New York Times early November 2024, right after the election, as blaming the Democrats' loss on, you guessed it, identity politics. Now, part of the problem with this term, it's so vacuous. I mean, what was he referring to? Was he referring to the fact that Black people voted against Mr. Trump generally 8-2? Obviously, he did not have that in mind. Was he referring to trans issues? Well, if so, he should come out and say it. And if he's referring to the fact that some of his so-called co-religionists in the Jewish community are captives of Zionism and captives of identity politics, he should come out and say it. But he won't, because, of course, he used to live in Israel. And in fact, this brings me to another question. In the United States, it's fair game to attack any aspect of Black existence, for example, Black nationalism, in any aspect of it. I mean, it's free speech, for example. But if a person like myself, a Black person, begins to make a critique of Zionism or aspects of Jewish political life, I'm a bigot, for example. I should shut up. I should lose my job, perhaps even be subjected to worse treatment. And given this sad and lamentable state of affairs, it's understandable why we may be on the verge of fascism in the United States of America.
I want to take a step back and ask you, since you said that the category of identity politics should be completely dispensed away, if unless and until one can use that convenient to describe white racism, Zionism, etc., etc. let's assume we dispense away with that category. I'm wondering what would be the category to be used if and when the left has to critique a section of the Black tradition, which which it doesn't see as a radical tradition. And I'm asking this because so much of your work has been on the Black radical tradition and how that has been suppressed and eventually broken. Of course, it's not been eliminated, but it has been weakened significantly since the 1960s and let's say 70s. If one is to critique uh, liberal progressive politics, what would that framework be? And to what extent one should spend time critiquing that liberal progressive uh, tradition? That's my question.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if I do, I would say that over the past 70 to 75 years, there was a dramatic shift in US political life. That is to say, the Black left, as exemplified by the late, great Paul Robeson, the Black left was tossed overboard. He was a linguist, a socialist, a devotee of Black resistance, etc., a Hollywood star, concert singer. His income fell in the 1950s from the six figures to the four figures. And what happened is that the US ruling class was under tremendous unremitting pressure by the socialist count because of US apartheid. And there was pressure to rid the United States of US apartheid or Jim Crow, white supremacy in juridical form. But instead of unilaterally seeking to rid itself of this pestilence, a deal was cut whereby the internationalists were tossed overboard. And this not only happened with regard to the Black movement, happened with regard to the labor movement in particular. Some of your audience may be familiar with Harry Bridges, the leader of West Coast Longshore, that is to say, Longshore, the dock workers from Seattle to San Diego, actually out into the Pacific and to Honolulu, led the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, born in Melbourne, Australia. There were repeated attempts to deport him. Alas, in the 1950s, as the Red Scare was heating up, he and his union were ousted from the House of Labor. And so this was also an effort by liberals to squash those to their left, not only with regard to the Black movement, but with regard to the labor movement in particular. And as a result of that particular transition, you had the rise of other trends, which theretofore had been marginal. I wrote a book on the relationship between Japan and Black America, pointing out that many Black nationalists were quite sympathetic to pre-1945 Japan. For example, many of them went to jail in November 1942 in East St. Louis, Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis. You had Black people drilling, anticipating a Japanese invasion that they were going to join with Japan. And these Black nationalist forces also uh, they they call themselves Asiatic. In fact, they did not necessarily call themselves African because they identified with Japan. But of course, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombing, the imprisonment of many of these forces, uh, they were squashed. But with the marginalizing and isolating of people like Robeson and his thousands, if not millions of comrades, they had a resurgence, for example, a resurgence that then was turbocharged in 1956 with the piratical attack of Israel, France, and Britain on Nasser's Egypt. And many of these Black nationalist forces identified with Nasser, like many of the Black community in general. Of course, many on the left identified with Nasser too, but they were, of course, running for their lives. They were being isolated, marginalized, sent into exile, and jailed. And so that gives a lift to many of these forces in the Black nationalist tradition, which many of our friends on the left object to, although they don't necessarily understand the historical forces that led to their rise. So it seems to me that if you're going to be a scientist of society, which is what many purport to be, you should have a scientific analysis, a comprehensive analysis of how certain ideological forces, how certain political forces rise and fall. And it does little good to just castigate and condemn these forces if you don't have an understanding of how they came to be in the first instance.
Yeah, let me reframe the question because I guess many on the left who uses frequently the term identity politics or woke politics, I personally don't think a lot of them would disagree with the tradition of W.B. Du Bois or Ben Davis, about whom he wrote a book about, Claudia Jones or William Patterson, Lauren Hansberry, etc., etc. Or even the Black Panthers. I think when they talk about woke politics, I think what they have in mind is people like Ibrahim Kendi, and etc. Et cetera. I don't want to name everyone. Um, and the politics they are talking about is that within that tradition there is no class politics, there is no substantive discussion about how wealth is produced and distributed and circulated, and there is also not much about internationalism, anti-imperialism, etc., which collectively sort of describes what radical tradition is. Would you agree with that kind of analysis? A critique of a tradition that talks about how people should feel. I mean, let me give a very crude example. There are many people who say that now in the universities we have to feel we'd have to think twice, thrice to critique a black figure because we might be labeled as racist. And that's where they say that there is an anti-intellectualism in that. I wonder what your thoughts on this kind of charge or this kind of argument.
Well, that last point baffles me because you go on a person like myself. I'm supposedly, I guess, a person who would be identified with the left, identified with socialism, identified with radicalism, but I'm being pilloried from every angle by many folks on the left. They don't seem to be nervous about criticizing me. Matter of fact, they criticize me in writing. you know, they criticize me on social media platforms, every venue that they can come up with. So these people who feel that they are being silenced somehow, I don't buy it. What I can buy, however, is what I said before, is that if you are critical of Zionism, for example, as there are examples too numerous to enumerate, you can run the risk of losing your job. I mean, that's where that's what they should be complaining about. And it's ridiculous. Now, with regard to certain figures who they feel are not sufficiently identified with the tradition of wealth redistribution and socialism, etc. Well, hello, we're in the United States of America, which had a Red Scare, which basically sent into exile, sent to prison, even assassinated in certain instances, people who identified with that tradition. You know, I just published in 2024 a book that dealt with the history of the Black Panthers, who you mentioned. Many of their leaders were sent to exile, jailed, assassinated, etc. And so, if you're going to criticize certain Black figures today who you feel are not sufficiently radical or not sufficiently leftist, well, you should understand the country in which they reside. You should understand the overriding political culture. I mean, is it asking too much to scrutinize the ruling class, since we know that the ruling ideas of any society are those of the ruling class, since we know that those who buck the ruling class oftentimes have to fear for their lives, fear for their very existence. And so it's hard for me to take these sorts of arguments seriously, quite frankly.
I also wanted to ask you about the claim that an excessive focus on race takes us away from class, and the argument often presented is the Sanders movement. It is said that one of the most radical political moment of U.S. history since, let's say, the 1960s was when the mobilization was done in the name of universal healthcare, wealth tax, et cetera, but very little tropes of um, even reparation was not discussed at great length, and issues of race was not taken up very centrally. And they said that there was a moment which did generate hope. And ultimately, if it did succeed, it would have overwhelmingly helped those who have been most oppressed throughout the history. I wonder what your thoughts are to this line of arguments within the left.
Well, let's take this strong. Excuse me for chuckling, but I guess these people don't read the newspapers either. I mean, on July 4th, 2025, you had the tangerine tyrant, Mr. Trump, sign an omnibus piece of legislation that guts healthcare, for example, particularly within his base, the working class and middle class base. And so this idea that universal remedies like healthcare bring us all together, how does it explain the gutting of healthcare just a few weeks ago, for example? I happened to be living in the United States during the struggle over Obamacare, for example, an attempt, at least in the minds of the Democrats, to take a step forward with regard to healthcare. You had a lot of people in the Tea Party, so called, who were precursors of the Trump base, who opposed that. And so that's what needs to be criticized. What all of this intellectual energy that's gone towards the so-called identity politics and black nationalism. Well, instead of doing critiques of the community that votes most heavily against the right wing, what they need to be looking at is class collaboration. I mean, it seems obvious. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Canada, where I'm working on a book that's sort of a comparative look at settler colonialism on both sides of the border. And what's striking about the US side of the border with regard to the 19th century is that just as in the West Bank recently, you've had settlers who have been attacking the military because they feel that they're not sufficiently aggressive in uprooting the Palestinians. The template for that movement was established south of the border in what is now Oregon and the state of Washington, where the European settlers said that the US military was not sufficiently aggressive in uprooting the Palouse, the Cayuse, the Walla Walla, and the other indigenous groupings. And so they took it upon themselves to organize and to take up arms to uproot the indigenous population, for example. And that's really, in many ways, what's still called democracy. Whatever a majority of the settlers decide to do, you either see it as democracy or you ignore it. And so if 77 million people vote for Mr. Trump in November 2024, you don't turn your spotlight or your microscope on that, for example, because whatever the majority of the settlers decide to do is kosher and okay by definition. That's democracy, even if it involves genocide, for example. And that helps to explain what's unfolding in historic Palestine as we speak, where, as I said, the settlers are taking it upon themselves to uproot Palestinians from the West Bank. And so this is the sort of analysis, if I may be so presumptuous, this is the sort of analysis that we need nowadays. And why it doesn't happen, well, I'll leave it to others to come to a conclusion.
It seems to me one of the problems is this excessive focus on electoral politics. I read in one of your books, I think it was the Ben Davis book, where you said somewhere at the beginning that a fair analysis of the Communist Party of the United States cannot be limited to elections. And you did discuss Ben Davis's elections to where he represented Harlem, but you said that it cannot be reduced to electoral politics because the presence of a strong Communist Party means much more than that. It means much stronger labor movement, much stronger resistance to police brutality, etc., etc. I wanted to ask you, do you think part of the failure of the left in the United States, but also in places like India and elsewhere, where broadly speaking, for the lack of a better word, we live under bourgeois democracy. There is an inability on the part of the left to move or rethink or think beyond electoral success, and what rather is the impact of politics on general society at large.
Well, I think your question has embedded in it the answer, which is that the answer being that the routing of the left during the Red Scare, the routing not only of the Communist Party, but those within their orbit, mass organizations in particular that were trying to build alliances across class lines and across race lines and across ethnic lines, for example, created favorable conditions for the rise of the right wing, and that therefore circumscribed and narrowed the political options of the left, leading to what you describe as an excessive focus on electoral politics. But even with regard to electoral politics, I think that there is room for improvement. For example, as you probably know, in the Democratic primary in the city of New York for mayor, Z. Kwame Mamdani, a card-carrying member of Democratic Socialists of America, prevailed, which has incited quite a bit of hysteria, not least on Wall Street, and not least within the 1%. But even with our friends on the left, I don't think that they have necessarily done an analysis. I mean, for example, what they consider to be an analysis is doing a critique of Mamdani himself, for example. Whereas my opinion is that an analysis, for example, why he didn't do better with regard to the Black constituency, would turn not upon his real and imagined abilities. It would turn upon the fact that many in the Black leadership in the Democratic Party did not support him, that voter turnout was not significant, that many in the Black community associate socialism with repression, because that's been the historic example, reference what we just said about Ben Davis and Paul Robeson and Claudia Jones, for example. And so if you're going to understand Mamdani's perspective or his weaknesses in the Black community in the electoral sense, it's not enough just to look at him and look at his positions, or even necessarily to look at DSA, which the Black leadership calls teen gentrification. That is to say, the Black leadership says that in neighborhoods like Brooklyn, the DSA members have more income and they can pay higher rents, which is pushing out Black renters and Black tenants. And so I think that even with regard to electoral politics, there needs to be room for improvement in terms of analysis. That is to say, as a general rule of thumb, when you engage in an analysis, you should engage in an analysis of forces, class forces, for example, race forces, for example, whereas oftentimes you'll find a substitute where you look at an individual. I mean, for example, following politics in the United States of America, uh, you would easily walk away with the idea if Donald Trump were to disappear tomorrow, well, then everything would become fine. But that ignores the forces that are pushing Donald Trump forward. That ignores what I just said about settler colonialism and class collaboration, for example. It ignores what I just said about how the indigenous population in so many parts of North America were liquidated literally at the hands of settlers, for example, because they thought the military was not sufficiently aggressive. And then this brings me back to another point, which I'd like to elaborate upon, where you said that in the United States there seems to be an excessive focus on, quote, race, unquote, and not on class. Well, if you've been listening to what I've been saying over the past few minutes, you would understand how and why that is. That is to say, when you make socialism radioactive, when you make radioactive the idea that you should do a class analysis, well, of course, there's going to be default to other categories. Not to mention my overriding point, which is that when you're talking about race, particularly with regard to the Black community, and we seem to be the community that is thought of when the concept of race is invoked, you're basically talking about descendants of an unpaid sector of the working class. So you're talking about a class issue fundamentally, which is obvious if you know beans about US history. But of course, I'm afraid to say that some of our friends on the left, they don't really know that much about history. I remember I was on a podcast. I've been on a number of podcasts talking about these same sorts of points. And the podcast hosts seem like they want to hurry me along to get away from history so we can return to the present moment so that they don't have to deal with these difficult questions of genocide against Native Americans and settlers literally strangling Native Americans in their beds, for example, and the kind of politics that that results in. That's too difficult. They'd rather talk about, I don't know, certain writers who they feel are not necessarily engaging the question of redistribution of the wealth.
Yeah, I agree. I think particularly the inability to read history leads us to, focus on issues that are not as important. I mean, to, as you said, to focus excessively on a writer rather than focusing on real issues like lynching, when wealth inequality, or access to credit when it comes to housing, the deep segregation of labor market. I've been to the United States. The moment you walk into a hospital, you see how segregated the health workforce is. If the doctors are exclusively white and the nursing and the support stuff is exclusively black, you walk into a grocery store, you see that segregation. I've been to Chicago, and there are neighborhoods like Englewood, which are like exclusively black and Latino population, and the whole life there is so different. I mean, the I was volunteering with one organizations, and we were told that the first thing we needed to tell them is that we don't work for the government. And I was a bit surprised, because in the global south, if you say people that I work for the government, people are generally, even poor people who don't necessarily get a lot from the government, they are generally more favorable to you because they think that you might be able to give them something. But there we were told that don't say that we work with the government, because their exclusive experience with the government is police brutality and being pushed around by insurance companies, etc., etc. So I think the main issues of our society goes out of the window, and then a few figures who of course make ridiculous money, spurning books out of these issues, become the central focus of our politics.
Well, it's interesting. There hasn't been sufficient scrutiny in this country as to why there's this anti-government ethos, which in many ways comes from the ruling class. I mean, for example, the dominant wing of the ruling class in the 1860s had their property expropriated by the government without compensation. Speaking of the slave owning wing of the ruling class, because they lost the Civil War and then lost billions of dollars in property in the bodies of enslaved Africans. And obviously, that makes them rather hostile to the government, which executed this maneuver. But refer also to my pre-Civil War example of what's happened in the Pacific Northwest, where the government was seen as restraining the settlers from seizing the land of the Native Americans. As a matter of fact, I was looking in the archive here in British Columbia the other day of a document from so-called pioneers in Oregon. And they were basically saying that a dominant theme of US history has been the citizens, or what I would call the settlers, basically thumbing their nose at the government, going back to 1763 with the proclamation line when the colonial power of London says to the settlers, don't continue moving west, seizing the land of the Native Americans because London has to spend blood and treasure in order to support that effort. They thumbed their nose at the government, tossed out London, had a counter revolution, continued moving west. And as I said, in the 1840s, in the state of Oregon and what is now the state of Washington, they felt that the government was continually trying to restrain them. So they turned against the government. And then, of course, the government forced through measures against Jim Crow, measures against US apartheid in the 1950s under unremitting pressure from the international community. And that led to mass uprisings amongst descendants of the settlers in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, where President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to protect black students from being mauled and torn from limb by teenagers who are descendants of settlers at Little Rock Central High School. A similar process, University of Mississippi, Oxford, 1962, where you had actual killings in an attempt to desegregate that particular institution. Boston, in 1970s, the so-called busing crisis, where once again the settler community they felt that a bargain was being corrupted. The bargain being that black people would be forevermore subordinate, and that would provide a certain kind of privilege in their minds to the melanin deficient, to the settler descendants, giving them a leg up with regard to hiring and with regard to getting government contracts, et cetera. Which brings me back to the question of today and the rather eerie parallels between certain tropes of the right and certain tropes of the left. I mean, for example, on the right, there is an all-out assault against diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're supposed to get nervous if you get on the plane and there's a black pilot because supposedly that black pilot has not been trained and won't be able to land the plane, and therefore you'll all crash. On the left, the parallel is, and I saw this with regard to the reaction of a book slated to be published by Mr. Biden's spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, a black woman with roots in the Caribbean. Some of our friends on the left, they were describing her
She's
as
also, if I'm not wrong, she's also queer, so that makes them even
exactly
more enraged.
right, as an identitarian
Right.
appointment. In other words, she is not capable, she is not qualified, she is identitarian. And so the right says DEI, the left says identitarian, but they both amount to the same thing fundamentally. And the fact that this is painfully obvious and intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers, one would imagine, somehow is not obvious to those who put forward these harebrained schemes.
I want to end by asking you one final question, and this is not necessarily this is my own question because today's show I mostly asked questions that are very rampant, of course, on the right, but the left has taken them up uncritically, and it disturbs me personally. One of the points was DEI. When I started engaging with US politics, I found it extremely shocking that things like affirmative actions would be dismissed almost entirely as part of a ruling class ideology. While in India, for instance, there are piles and piles of studies how affirmative actions in education and government jobs have helped the Dalit community to make upward mobility. I mean, of course, it's not the panacea for all evils. Like it doesn't restructure society completely, but it does help the community a lot. Thomas Piketty himself has said that things like reparations, affirmative actions, do make a lot of contribution to economic development of people who are at the bottom most of the ladder. But when I started talking to people from the United States, people on the left, they just completely dismiss all of that as a ruling class ideology, shorthand of which is DEI. But I wanted to ask you a question, and I know you are a historian, you are not an economist, a policymaker, but I'm just curious um, if you were to tell us about, let's think about the Sanders campaign or Mamdani, what else should be there, in your opinion, which should perhaps make it more comprehensive? Because things like Mamdani is talking about freezing of rent, and I assume that would help all poor people, which would include a lot of black people, and raising of minimum wages, free public transportation, etc., taxing the rates, etc., etc., would definitely help black people at large. So apart from the reparation thing, what else should be there in terms of policies or politics that you think would make a Mamdani campaign or a Sanders campaign more effective and more comprehensive, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, with regard to your example from India, I would also point out Malaysia, for example, where if affirmative action has been applied systematically. And my opinion is you cannot separate the economic growth rates in that Southeast Asian nation from this progressive application of affirmative action. I would also say that with regard to Brazil, there have been steps that we would call affirmative action on these shores to uplift the Black population, in particular, the indigenous population, for example. And it is rather curious, as you just pointed out,
I
that
also very quickly, I'm sorry. I also just wanted to add the reason why Muslim population in India, despite starting above the Dalit population, has in this 75 to 80 years has fallen below in many respects, below the Dalits, because for one reason the Muslims are treated as second class in India. For another reason, they have no affirmative actions either in education or in government jobs. So recent reports that have looked at the conditions of the Muslims in India have seen that they have actually fallen behind due to lack of any affirmative actions on one hand and complete depoliticization within the larger body politics. While the Dalits, they have not risen to where they should have, or the Adivasis, the indigenous population in South Asia, but they have definitely made progress. So I just wanted to present that as well.
well, fair enough. And I would also say that with regard to this canard, that affirmative action, diversity, equity, inclusion is a malicious trick by the ruling class to divide the working class. Well, this ignores some of the history I've just recounted, whereby there was this bargain struck some decades ago, whereby the left, the black left would be tossed overboard, the black liberals would be elevated. Part of the package was affirmative action to increase the number of black managers. But it's not only that, it's the fact that black people in mass organizations were pushing for affirmative action, for pushing for more black police officers because they thought that they would be less likely to pull the trigger. Look at the DPOA case, the Detroit police officers case, which helped to establish many principles of affirmative action. There were black construction workers who were seeking to extirpate this job trust, whereby settler descendants would pass on skilled occupations to their children, be it carpenters, electricians, etc. Black people were pushing to enter these skilled construction trades. It wasn't just so. In other words, we make demands and force by various means the ruling class to capitulate, and then the left comes along and says ignores our struggle and says we're basically pawns of the ruling class. I mean, it's bad history, it's bad politics, it's poor thinking. Now, with regard to Mamdani, what I find curious about this campaign, and it brings us back to the question of identity politics, because just like the question of anti-Semitism has been weaponized to destabilize the Corbyn leadership in London, it's now being weaponized against Mamdani. You've had leading pro-Zionist politicians like Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, former U.S. ambassador to Japan, and former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who've been bashing Mamdani because of his sympathy for the Palestinians, because he won't repudiate the phrase globalize the intifada, for example. And so one would think that those on the left who are sincerely and truly concerned about progress and concerned about identity politics, that they would look at identity politics coming within those who have been inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness. For example, those in the pro-Zionist community, those who are tied at the hip to
But
pro-Zionist
but
being.
but but they would say that they're already very critical of Zionism. I mean, they would not accept that charge that they are
Yeah, but they're
not.
not saying they're not connecting it to identity politics. That's my point.
Right, right. Hmm.
It's not just being critical of Zionism or being critical of Israel or being critical of genocide, or being critical of mass starvation. I'm saying have a standard whereby you introduce this trope, identity politics, but then it disappears when it comes to looking at the powerful. I mean, for example, at a Mamdani office in Queens, New York, just the other day, you had an example of identity politics. Many Italian Americans were picketing because they don't like what Mamdani has had to say about Christopher Columbus, who, of course, was born in Genoa, what is now Italy, for example. That was identity politics, for example. But that's not put in the context of identity politics. I'm just saying that if you have this trope that's disproportionately used against the powerless and hardly ever used against those inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness, you should check yourself. You should engage in some self-criticism. Now, with regard to what Mamdani can do further, as is well known, a lot of the politics and the political economy of New York is controlled from Albany, controlled by the governor, who, as to my understanding, has not even endorsed him as of yet, even though she is in the same political party, the Democratic Party. Uh, Obviously, what we need in the United States is an unleashing of the labor movement, which can only in part come from New York City. It, in the first instance, has to come from Albany and Washington, for example, which presupposes that this may be beyond the immediate capability of a mayor, Mamdani. But what he can do, of course, is use his bully pulpit. What I would say is that we need to return to where we began. And we began by talking about the Red Scare and the marginalizing of the internationalists amongst us. We need a resuscitation of internationalism in the left. You have people on the left who really don't even understand what's going on in Canada. That's right next door, for example. Certainly, they don't understand what's going on in Africa. I mean, I'm shocked and appalled by that. Even though you have all these Africans walking the streets of the cities of the United States, you would think they would wonder, how did these people get here? And what's their story? Besides being captives of affirmative action or captives of identity politics.
Yeah, I haven't seen US left taking up what's going on in Sahel, for instance, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. There are very important radical movements going on. I'm under the leadership of people like Ibrahim Traore, fighting against French imperialism, nationalizing industry so that more and more Africans can get jobs, better jobs, and they're just not there within US left politics. And even like places like Vietnam or China. I mean, uh, there are remarkable things going on in these places as far as empowering people are concerned, but they are just not there. Just talking about internationalism, given so much of your work has been to bring these strands of anti-imperialism, internationalism, and anti-capitalism along with the Black radical tradition. That's how I see your work to define radicalism. If and I think just to add to your point, sorry.
Well, no, it's all good. And let me return to another point that you raised, which is that often what's neglected, even in the Black community, and there's a debate going on in the Black community that reflects this, is that people like myself, understandably, we toss around the term racism quite a bit. But as I said in my book on 1776, in the United States, there is a concentrated and unique and peculiar persecution of the descendants of enslaved Africans in the area from Virginia to Texas. In other words, there is a kind of national origin discrimination that we call racism. And it is racism, but it's also national origin discrimination, which also, this Black conservative writer, Thomas Sowell, Sowell, he's made a
Is
whole
a
career, made a good living.
Nobel laureate economist.
What? Did he win a Nobel? I know
I
he's been
yes,
nominated.
I
Oh
I
my
think
God.
so. I'll check if I'm wrong, but I think he
Right.
has one. Yeah.
So every year or so, he writes a book saying, look at these Nigerian immigrants. How well that they've done. So how can you say there's racism? The problem is these Black Americans. They're just incompetent. They can't get their act together, etc.
Yeah, he
And
doesn't have a
so,
Nobel Prize. I just wanted to correct
right,
myself.
right,
Yep,
right.
yep, yep.
He writes the same book every year or so. But he ignores the point that I just made, which is that what we call racism is actually national origin discrimination. Because, my ancestors and the ancestors of people like myself, my ancestors are in the slave South and Mississippi, for example, the heart of darkness when it comes to the United States. We're the ones who have been battling the right wing toe to toe, taking blows and delivering a few. So, understandably, uh, people like myself, the descendants of the enslaved Africans in Dixie, will receive the heaviest blows. And so, because there's an imperfect understanding of what I just said, it's led to this movement, I'm afraid to say, in the Black community, whereby Black people like myself or people whose roots are in the slave South are now trying to distance themselves from immigrants, Nigerian immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, etc., which of course is foolhardy and self-defeating. And also, if the Black community does not understand this point, understandably, immigrants do not understand this point. For example, when Mr. Trump entertained the leaders from West Africa in the White House the other day, he told the leader of Liberia, "Oh, you speak such good English," for example. Obviously, he's unfamiliar with the history of Liberia, set up by the United States 200 years ago to deport the free Negro population there and the enslaved African population being free to a certain degree. And the president of Liberia was too polite to point out this history. But in the Toronto Globe and Mail, you had this guy from an immigrant population pointing out, well, where's the insult? I mean, why should anybody be insulted that Mr. Trump would point out that this guy speaks good English? And if obviously ignorant of the history, ignorant of Mr. Trump's own history, for example, which then brings me to this other point, which is that in terms, on the one hand, I was just making a critique of how even the Black community does not understand its own plight. And if they don't understand their own plight, how can you expect immigrants to understand their plight? I mean, perhaps understandable. But at the same time, for example, the ruling class, even though some of our friends on the left feel that we, the descendants of enslaved Africans, get special privileges, actually it's the exact opposite. We get special persecution For example, these hospitals that you were visiting in Chicago, uh, if you were to see any black doctors, oftentimes, of course, you would not be surprised if it were a Nigerian doctor, for example, or even a South Asian doctor, for example. So, as I said, the United States is a complex society, but it's not a mystery. I mean, it's not sufficiently complex that you can't understand it. It just takes a little insight and perhaps taking the blindfold away from your eyes.
We'll leave it there, Professor Horn. Thank you so much for this. And next time we'll take up one of your books to have more substantive discussion. But I think as a left platform, this was helpful, even though at times it must have irritated you. At times the arguments I presented to you on the behalf of the left were juvenile or even stupid. But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.